Hi. So good to see all of you. So many beautiful faces, so many familiar faces. Thank you so much for coming here. Hello to the people online. Thank you for coming as well to this beautiful 9th and final annual lecture of ReproSoc by Sarah Franklin. Yay. I will give a short introduction and then we can enjoy Sarah's talk, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A. Everything must come full circle. Here we are back at the new museum site, ReproSoc's ancestral home for the 9th and final annual lecture. This is where Sarah Franklin gave her inaugural lecture a decade ago in 2013. And around the corner in the Mond building is also where I joined ReproSoc 2 years later, right after Sarah examined my PhD in Amsterdam. ReproSoc has been my academic home ever since. And in the same year, in 2015, the first annual lecture happened in a series showcasing monumental speakers who have each deeply shaped how we think about reproduction. Some of you may remember that first lecture by Emily Martin from NYU, who revisited her most influential publication on the egg and the sperm here in Cambridge with us. The following year, we had the honor of welcoming the highly distinguished Professor Marcia Inhorn, one of the world's leading medical anthropologists and a close friend and collaborator of ReproSoc, who explored a global market in fertility services, drawing on her many years of fieldwork in Dubai. The next year, Sarah described our guest Ross Pachesky as #legend. She wrote Abortion and Women's Choice in '84, a foundational text in the critical study of control over women's bodies through restrictions on reproductive freedom. Sadly, this work continues to be so relevant today, as was the subject of her talk on securitization and reproductive politics in the context of Israel-Palestine. Professor Karis Thompson from LSE in Berkeley is another legend and dear friend of ReproSoc, who is the author of influential books like Making Parents and Good Science, and she had a beautiful talk with us on the importance of considering migration as foundational to the sociology of reproduction. The brilliant Anindita Majumdar from Hyderabad in India, an IIT, who is close to my heart, spoke on a topic close to my heart, the biological clock. And she shared about reproductive aging in India. And then COVID happened. It was a confusing time, but a comfort to connect with all the ReproSocs on Zoom, as we continue to do. And the annual lecture too had to move online. And we had, notwithstanding the digital format, the joy of welcoming Frans Windwans-Trine from UC Santa Barbara, who set our screens alight with her rousing talk that spoke to the issues of reproductive justice, incarceration, eugenics, and forced sterilization in California. Likewise, responding to the political urgency of reproduction was the eminent scholar Joanna Mizilinska from the Polish Academy of Sciences, who called attention to the political struggle of LGBT people in the Polish context. Last year, we could return to in-person lectures with the glorious Professor Emily Jackson from LSE, who responded to important political moments as the prospect of a revision of the HFEA fertility law is imminent. She offers a tour de force of the regulation of reproduction with her characteristic precision, rigor, and charm. But notwithstanding all these absolutely amazing scholars, we saved the best for last, which is Sarah Franklin. It's a true honor to introduce Sarah today, who is so cherished and appreciated by all of us here, all of us online and beyond, not only because of her brilliant work, but because she brings all of us together with her enthusiasm, wit, and wisdom. She has, as you know, been working on questions of reproduction for decades. She's at the heart of the development and growth of the social study of reproduction. And she truly needs no introduction, but here's a quick reminder of some of her achievements. She's, of course, the professor of sociology, former head of department and director of ReproSoc here at the University of Cambridge. For the past 3 decades, she has researched reproduction and is one of the key thinkers and creators of the field of reproductive studies and reproductive sociology. Her research is prolific and adventurous, spanning from IVF to basic science, to empire, to humans and animals, especially sheep, and plants, especially corn. This breadth of interest crossing disciplinary boundaries and connecting the dots between technological, biological, cultural, and the political is reflected in many of the beautiful books she's written that you know, including Embodied Progress, Dolly Mixtures, Born and Made, Biological Relatives, Relative Values. And there is several new books on the way, but one that I'll mention is the new Reproductive Order book, which is the outcome of our Changing Infertility's Wellcome grant, to which many of us have contributed, and which is coming out with New York University Press soon. But it has to be said, Sarah is not only a fantastic influential thinker and researcher, she's also an inspiring and energetic creator of lecture series like these, research institutes, institutional change, creative projects such as exhibitions and sheep rap songs. She must, in this context, particularly be celebrated for creating ReproSoc, which she founded 10 years ago. We've had a decade of reproduction. ReproSoc has been and is an academic home for so many of us, for which we are so, so grateful. ReproSoc not only provides a space for researching reproduction through intellectual proximity and collaboration and curiosity, but it's also has a commitment to feminism and by always engaging with what's at stake politically and providing a place for reflection and action as we live through Brexit and Trump and Johnson's COVID years together. And this continues to be sadly relevant today, particularly after yesterday's Dutch elections in which far-right leader Geert Wilders became the largest party. In ReproSoc, scholarship speaks to politics with a critical response, with activism, and with a space to mourn and to act and to think together. In fact, ReproSoc is our own hope technology. So in doing so, ReproSoc is a pillar and reference point in the development of the field of reproductive sociology, and a field that puts reproduction at the center and understands it as integral to understanding social change at large, whether it pertains to gender, race, the economy, the environment, or the nature of the human itself. Sarah is, of course, the heart of ReproSoc and is much appreciated by everyone for making it rigorous and stimulated, as well as fun and supportive, thereby creating its own kind of kinship structure. She's committing to lifting everyone up around her, and many of us would not be near where we are today without her and her support. And her particular way of running a research group, with its commitment to collaboration and support and feminist care and fun, provides a model for all of us who work in universities. It provides an antidote to audit and management and competitive management cultures that suck the joy out of our work, and presents a different model for remaking the university that is nourishing and engaging at all levels. Luckily, Sarah has been recognized for this by the Society for the Social Study of Science with a mentoring award. She has been awarded countless research grants from many funders across the UK, including the British Academy, ESRC, Wellcome, and more recently, the very cool Royal Society Medal. Congratulations. Lastly, Sarah has to be celebrated for creating infrastructural change. Here at Cambridge, she has created the LGBT+ at CAM networks, several studentships, numerous postdoc positions, research groups, collaborative research and engagement teams, art projects, and she's played a very active role in the protest for labor rights and changing the Department of Sociology. And of course, by living a feminist life, by being an agent of change in this very highly stimulating, but also in many ways very traditional university. And there's one more thing I would like to say before I give her the floor, that I would like to say about Sarah and how she makes ReproSoc and my experience of working with her so special. What is so special about Sarah is that she always supported us and always allowed us to support her when things were hard or intense. And when we were sad or ill, or when baby socks joined us, or when we lost those we loved deeply, she was there. With her golden heart, with her kind patience, with her incredible ability to listen, with her open eyes and grounded feet, with wisdom and with humor. And when we were not there, she would see our lives and our losses in the plants and the animals around her. In a collection of seeds, in the circling flight of owls, she would return with soothing stories and with little gifts that make her smile. And it's this openness in how she speaks to the world and how the world speaks back, in how she brings her whole self to ReproSoc and her work, and how she allows us to bring our whole selves back, for which I'm most grateful. So thank you, Sarah. And let's welcome to the floor, and join me in welcoming to the stage, Sarah Franklin. Thank you.
I brought a friend. Thank you so much, Lizzie. What a lovely introduction. Can you hear me okay, everyone? Yeah, not too echoey. Thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful to see all of you here tonight in this very special room, which has been beautifully redecorated since we were last here. And it's really wonderful to be able to look back over the projects that we've done over the past 12 years since ReproSoc got started, which has, as Lucy said, really been a source of sustenance to all of us through times that have often been quite difficult. And I feel very, very fortunate to be speaking to you tonight because we do now really have a field we can call reproductive studies. And it is really, truly, deeply an interdisciplinary endeavor. And one of the most important questions we can ask is how we reproduce our world, how we reproduce our communities, and how to build infrastructures that will sustain us all. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is both the journey we've taken to this point and what we've learned about reproduction along the way. I also want to approach these questions within a framework that is very central to sociology, which is the question of social causality. So in particular, the question of reproductive causality has been the core focus of my research for over 40 years. And this is because, like all truly interesting questions, it continues to reappear in new forms. Cause and effect is, at one level, simply a point of view. It's a way to look at something, a perspective. Cause and effect can be studied empirically, but this relation or equation can also be used rhetorically, and it's often used ideologically. Cause and effect can be direct and obvious or oblique and queer. All of these points are also true of reproduction, which, like cause and effect, can be a noun or a verb, a condition or a process, a description or an event. And while this might all sound very confusing or pointless, it's also what makes reproductive cause and effect so interesting to study. For me, the question of reproductive cause and effect has always been something of a double question. There is the question of how reproductive cause and effect is normatively framed and understood, for example, and then there are all the other points of view from which we can draw very different conclusions about what is causing what exactly. I'll give a specific example in a moment, but for now, just let me explain that this question can also be rephrased to point out simply that many things appear differently if you look at them from the point of view of asking what are the reproductive infrastructures that brought them into being. So let's take a very simple example of the most common understanding of the term reproduction, which is biological reproduction. On the one hand, there is the question of biological causality. How does biological reproduction work? On the other, there's the question of why people have children. Although these are very different questions, the one is often posed as the effect of the other. People have children because they have to biologically reproduce to survive, or because it's the biological purpose of the species, or because humans are part of nature, and it's natural to reproduce. In turn, people use the biological facts of reproduction to account for the causes of other things. For example, they're used to explain gender differences, the sexual division of labor, the gender pay gap, even though we all know there's no reason why your uterus should determine your salary. A different way to explain both the causality of biological reproduction and the reasons people want to have children would be social explanation. For example, it could be pointed out that although human reproduction is a fundamentally biological process, it is neither an exclusively biological one nor something that happens automatically. Human reproduction has to be socially organized and activated in order to take place. It does not happen by itself. by definition, it is never a purely individual matter. The reproduction of new human beings, even in its strictly biological form, cannot take place independently of the social systems in which it is always already embedded. But even though it is the social organization of reproduction, not biology, that causes children to be born, this may not be how people think of it themselves. One of the main reasons that new reproductive technologies, such as IVF, offer such an important perspective on the social organization of reproduction is because the biological model of reproduction does not work in that context. For people who know perfectly well what is biologically necessary to initiate a pregnancy, but discover these facts are not enough to make a baby, there is often the experience not only of a causal vacuum, but a sense of overwhelming loss and bewilderment. There is, as so many of my interviewees in my very first study of early IVF users so vividly stated, a sense of their entire world collapsing. As many IVF users have discovered, the usual model of biological cause and effect has a serious flaw. It turns out that this model, egg plus sperm equals baby, only works retrospectively. This equation, that it takes an egg and a sperm to make a baby, is only causally accurate or valid, or even logical, when there already is a baby. It is not a predictive equation. The simple question I was asking when I began to study IVF in the mid-1980s was how people make sense of this gap in reproductive cause and effect. What I did not know then, 40 years ago, was how much this question would turn out to reveal about the changing social organization of reproduction, and very quickly also about biological reproduction too. What I did not know, because the curious thing about reproductive causality is that it can be so apparently obvious, while at the same time being so endlessly elusive. Even in the biology lab, attempts to literalize precise scientific facts of reproduction never fully succeed. Instead, even the most authoritative accounts of fundamental biological events, such as fertilization, seem to recede even as they advance, throwing up whole new problems no one had even thought of before the latest paradigm change took hold. A second-order irony of this simple fact about the facts of life is that even the most literal descriptions of reproductive causality, even when they are expressed in strictly technical terms, are mostly used to talk about other things. The use of DNA to talk about almost everything from car engines to fashion brands is but one example of this. And this simultaneous determinism and fluidity of biological explanations, both within and outside the biology lab, is one of the very queer truths about reproductive causality that has important lessons for us today. Another is a corollary of this point, which is that it is precisely because of this duplicity of reproductive causality in so many of its forms that it provides such a useful analytic lens. In ReproSoc, we call this the Repro lens, and it's the point on which I will conclude tonight's lecture. So let's start with a very simple point from an earlier ReproSoc annual public lecture, the first, which was given in 2015 by Emily Martin, entitled The Egg and the Sperm 2.0. This lecture revisited and reprised Martin's now classic account of the egg and the sperm, the famous article published in the feminist journal Science nearly a quarter of a century ago in 1991. As an anthropologist, Martin wrote in the opening sentence of this article, "I am intrigued," she said, "by the possibility that culture shapes how biological scientists describe what they discover about the natural world." She noted further that if this is the case, we would be learning more than natural history in high school biology classes. The textbook egg and sperm narrative, as she shows, strongly suggests this is the case. The subtitle of the article simply states Martin's critical observation that the supposedly objective biological account of the egg and sperm provided in standard textbooks depicts instead a stereotypical romance narrative that contains a highly exaggerated parody of male and female roles. We all know this story. The demure and passive egg waits in her secretive cervical chamber as her valiant suitor battles the elements to capture her at last. Martin's point was not new. Indeed, the feminist critique of highly gendered conception narratives that celebrate male heroism and naturalize female passivity was already a very well-worn path in feminist theory by 1991. In fact, it was found as early as the 1940s in Ruth Hirschberger's chapters Society Writes Biology in her 1948 volume Adam's Rib. However, Emily Martin's husband, Richard Cohn, was a biophysicist and a specialist in the biology of fertilization. And it was in his Johns Hopkins lab that the received wisdom about the passive role of the egg was significantly rewritten in the 1980s based on new empirical evidence that more or less reversed that picture, showing how actively the egg choreographs the entire process of fertilization from start to finish. And so Emily Martin was not only able to point out the continuing adherence to the stereotypic story of the fat, slow egg being captured by the Olympic swim champion, but to show how very little impact new knowledge, new scientific facts had on this fairy tale version of textbook conception. In contrast to its reputed passivity, the Johns Hopkins researcher in Cohn's lab had, by the late 1980s, uncovered many of the leading roles in which the egg was undoubtedly the more active player. But Martin found that even in articles by prominent experts, the outmoded adventure conquest narrative was only strengthened rather than contradicted. Given the egg's new superpowers and hostility to unwelcome visitors, it was even more impressive that the sperm could fight its way through. Within a decade, it would be confirmed that the egg cytoplasm is so powerful, it can reprogram a fully adult cell nucleus to go back in time, de-differentiate, and be rendered capable of fusing with the egg nucleus to become a viable offspring. This had previously been considered biologically impossible. But Jolly, you knew she was coming, didn't you? Yeah, you knew she was coming. Oh, where is she? Oh, there she is. But Jolly and her sibling sheep, Megan, Morag, Taffy, Tweed, Cyril, Polly, Tracy, and Molly, put an end to all that passive egg malarkey with one stamp of their collective ovine hooves. In the wake of the ingenious series of experiments combining cell culture and cell cycle expertise with somatic cell nuclear transfer by Ian Wilmot's Rosalind team throughout the 1990s, the prolonged process of cellular acrobatics orchestrated by OVA HQ would come to be seen as one of the most important scientific discoveries of the century. Not long after it was discovered that the egg not only physically deconstructs the sperm upon entry, but proceeds to repackage, rewrite, and reposition its DNA, the egg was renamed. It became the egg complex. Today, in the context of new epigenetic understandings of inheritance, the egg cell is seen as the ultimate genetic supercomputer, and whole new mysteries about its biological potency have been opened up to further exploration. Do you want some water? Okay, yeah. If you want some water, we can share. And of course, this picture. So by 2015, in the inaugural ReproSoc annual public lecture 8 years ago, Emily Martin was able to add quite a bit more data to the picture, not only of what is known scientifically about the biophysics of fertilization, but the molecular mechanisms of reprogramming through which the egg cell rapidly disassembles the sperm, unpacks its DNA, disposes of the sperm body, repackages the nuclei of both male and female gametes, and reprograms paternal DNA before physically facilitating the formation of a new individual genome and epigenome. And of course, this picture continues to change rapidly, 10 years later still. And with new understandings of how much DNA is told what to do inside the cell, much of what had been assumed about 20th century DNA has changed as well. Like the heroic sperm conquistador, DNA's leading role in the drama of biological development now looks more like a busy telephone exchange operator in the overall cellular machinery. But interestingly, this takes us back to the point I made at the outset about the irony of the very important fact that even the most literal descriptions of reproductive causality, and even when they are expressed in strictly technical terms, are mostly used to talk about other things. Despite, or maybe even because, of how the linear dogmatic role of DNA has been downsized in biology, its ability to signify an essentially determining blueprint or singular coded message seems to have morphed into a cultural rather than a biological coding function. For indeed, it is now as a metaphor or idiom or analogy that DNA reigns supreme. The figure of speech DNA is now more determining as a metaphor than as a molecule. This refiguring of DNA as a ubiquitous quotidian idiom for an essential and predetermined identity is another example of a reproductive model. The analogy, for example, that it is in Cambridge University's DNA to pursue scientific discovery uses DNA to signify both an innate quality and a causal relation. Such a statement both invokes a distinguished historical legacy and predicts a future of yet further scientific achievement. The image of a blueprint with which the figuration of DNA is so closely linked directly signifies reproductivity. A blueprint, after all, is a means of reproduction. Like the debates about the egg and sperm and DNA, today's debates about fertility and global fertility decline are also spoken in two languages of reproductive causality, one of which is literal and scientific, but non or questionably causal, and the other of which is non-literal but significantly causal. I can elaborate with a series of examples. Demography is the most literal scientific language to describe fertility in empirical terms. And it is a language full of rates and tables, numbers and statistics, although also of questionable axioms, principles, and hypotheses. Demographic modeling of reproductive cause and effect has long been criticized for its over-reliance on rational choice models and quasi-allegorical theories, such as the demographic transition hypothesis, which have never fully been proven. On the one hand, the number 1.6, 2.3, 4.7 that represents the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children born to an average woman per annum as calculated subject to certain conditions, is clearly an empirical measure. How accurate it is, however, depends a great deal on which factors you prioritize and how you build your equations. Past patterns are used to guide future fertility predictions since there is no alternative to using historical data. Following COVID, the world financial crisis, and increased migration due to both military conflict and environmental damage, fertility has become much harder both to measure and to predict. Indeed, as ReproSoc research over the past 12 years has consistently shown, human fertility constitutes an increasingly vivid but elusive picture of reproductive cause and effect. To give just a few examples of how qualitative research has introduced new questions of cause and effect into the study of fertility behaviors, intentions, and patterns, let me give you a few very brief examples. Let's start with Robert Prelat. Oh, is Robert here? Hi, Robert. Who is a member of ReproSoc and now works in the This Institute. Robert made a fascinating discovery in his path-breaking research on ideas about parenting amongst young non-heterosexual people in Britain as part of an innovative nationwide research project he conducted for his PhD. He found that a key variable influencing young, non-heterosexual people's attitudes towards parenting was the kind of communication they had had with their parents about hypothetical future reproductivity and family life. It was these conceptions, he argued, about non-heterosexual parenting that strongly shaped attitudes towards the possibility of his research subjects having children themselves, or not. So Robert's finding confirms a very well-established principle of reproductive studies, which is that changing perceptions of reproductivity directly affect reproductive behavior, choices, and intentions. Reproductive imaginaries, in other words, have causal effects on reproductive outcomes. This point has been equally crucial to Katie Dow's longstanding research on the overlap between concerns about the environment and reproductive politics, manifest in a range of forms from parenting choices, including the choice not to parent at all, to the pursuit of urban horticulture as a form of alternative community building. That worked really well. That's better than technology. As part of our Wellcome funded Changing Infertility's research project, which ran from 2018 to 2022, Lucy Vandeville has shown how a technology that is often seen as a response to infertility, IVF, now plays an increasingly significant role in reshaping perceptions of fertility, for example, by significantly extending the imagined time frame of fertility planning. She refers to this as extended fertilities. In his study of gay dads using surrogacy, Marcin Smetana has similarly shown how fertility planning has become much more explicit, collective, extended, and activist. He has introduced the term spreadsheet fertility to talk about the elaborate amount of forward planning often involved in LGBTQ parenting. However, as Nitzan Perry-Rotem and other demographers working with us have suggested, more elaborate fertility planning is now a much more common practice for heterosexual couples as well, in no small part due to the rapid increase in the use of IVF and other forms of assisted reproduction. Related to this, of course, is the increased emphasis on fertility decline, which, as Io Wahlberg has shown in his research for our project, can in part be calibrated through the rise of new fertility figures, as he calls them, such as the bare branch, a figuration to describe unmarried childless men in China. These figures are arising in the context of moral, national, and generational panics about fertility that also wrap questions of citizenship, governmentality, and futurity into their symbolic logics and representational forms. As Marcia Inhorn and I describe in the introduction to the anthology that is just now going into production with NYU Press, the significant rise in the use of assisted reproductive technology coupled with the enormous expansion of this sector must be understood in the context of rapid global fertility decline to introduce what we are calling a new reproductive order. On the basis of the research conducted by over 30 researchers in 16 different countries over the past 5 years, we suggest that a core feature of the new reproductive order is an altered logic of reproductive cause and effect. A good example is assisted technologies like IVF, which were once seen as the effects of rising infertility, but are now playing a much more active role in influencing how reproductivity itself is conceived. As Marilyn Strathern long ago predicted, IVF has significantly changed the reproductive grammar of cause and effect. Increasingly, it is not simply an egg and a sperm that make a baby. More may well be needed, and indeed, even more may not be enough. The helping hands of technology have changed how reproductive intentionality is conceived and often how it can be realized or not. But a number of other changes have occurred as well, entirely apart from the actual business of achieving fertility objectives or not, and how reproductive models have been changed as a result of IVF is another change that is possibly even more widespread and consequential. Probably the most important finding of all in our 5-year project is the extent to which conceptions of fertility have become condensed figurations of other things, such as concern about the environment. We call this the barometer effect, and it describes the way in which both fertility and infertility have become overdetermined signifiers of both precarity and power, and thus of inequality, struggle, and conflict. We also show how this new shift in how fertility is used to signify precarity occurs at several different levels: individually, globally, nationally, and in relation to specific issues such as global warming, austerity economics, anxieties about the food chain, unemployment, and job insecurity. As reproductive models, moreover, we found that figurations of infertility are also increasingly often depict the interconnections between widely disparate social forces, structures, and events, such as cuts to welfare services, inadequate healthcare, restrictive migration policies, border patrols, mass incarceration, earthquakes, militarization, war, environmental toxicity, traffic jams, endangered species, mining, the gig economy, and a long list of other factors which occur in the 20 chapters of our new book. From this point of view, 3 key points emerge. One is that infertilities are structural and increasingly seen as such. The infrastructures needed to support reproductive freedom and to enable reproductive justice are increasingly seen to be part of the cause and effect relations that organize the reproductivity not only of humans, but our entire planet. The second major point is that fertility and infertility are now being used to describe existential threats that are not individual, but shared in common. And the third point is that fertility justice is seen to be highly stratified, so that the politics of fertility inequality now map on to many other political and social justice issues. It's easy to predict that this will increase over time. So this is why we are claiming, on the basis of our research, that the new reproductive order is not simply a matter of a new set of models or grammars about reproductive cause and effect, but a newly explicit consciousness about these connections and their consequences for us all, as well as their differential consequences for different sectors of society and our world, and why these are also symbols of precarity, endangered futurity, and structural inequality. Which brings us back to where I began this talk and my own research in this field, namely with an examination of the role of biological models of reproduction or their absence and how they are used to signify in accounts of reproductive causality. Because it turns out that the real question raised by IVF is not how to fix broken biology, which it sometimes does, but how we understand the importance of fertility more broadly, and in particular, how these connections affect us all. Indeed, in another irony, IVF reveals the very tunnel vision that has in many ways obscured the essentially social origins of biological reproductivity. The very fact that both fertility and infertility are being used to talk about so many other things further reveals why this truth has become so much more important. Reproduction is a vital collective social infrastructure. Even trees, it turns out, communicate through their mycorrhizal networks about who in their community will grow up to fill the gap in the canopy when an elder tree falls to the ground. In her recent book, Motherhood on Ice, exploring the narratives of over 250 women interviewed about freezing their eggs, Marcia Inhorn found that it was not career aspirations that led many professionally successful women to delay starting a family, but instead the impossibility of finding an equally committed partner with whom to pursue this much desired goal. Part of this picture, Inhorn argues, is a widening educational gap between men and women in the United States. Individual fertility, she clearly demonstrates, may feel personally intentional, but it is causally infrastructural. This same point was made differently in China during the COVID pandemic by the young man who pushed back against police officers' threat that his family would be punished for 3 generations if he refused to go into a quarantine camp. "We are the last generation," he protested. His retort became a meme, a hashtag, and a rallying cry through which the impossibility of having children not only confirmed but symbolized economic, environmental, and existential precarity. While the government is pushing its citizens to have as many children as possible to rejuvenate an aging population, a recent study showed that two-thirds of Chinese women between 18 and 31 do not plan to have any children at all. In Iran, as Soraya Tremaine's recent work on the zigzagging pro- and anti-natalist policies of the Iranian government reveals, a dissident generation of reproductive refusers understand their chosen childlessness to be a direct form of protest against the government. Similar data has been collected in many other countries, including Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and in many parts of Europe. Thus, at the same time that egg donation and surrogacy have grown exponentially and globally as income-generating activities for a new generation of young women, the market for such services has ballooned, diversified, and become one of the fastest-growing investment sectors for venture capital. Here, too, is a new reproductive infrastructure, what Sigrid Wertemann has called the reproductive industrial complex, servicing a highly stratified global market where lucrative profits are generated through bespoke fertility products and services run by multinational conglomerates. We are now not only in the age of IVF, but of IVF, the age of fertility monitoring apps, fertility financial services, and fertility insurance, all of which can be researched in more depth at your local fertility fair. We are consequently also in the age of iFertility, an age in which fertility information is at a premium, and even your own access to your own potential fertility is likely to be heavily mediated by a variety of online technologies, digital services, websites, and portals. This is an age in which fertility differentials are both more visible and more emblematic of social justice issues than ever before. As our video series on fertility futures points out, it is also an age in which reproductive, environmental, and transformative justice movements are becoming more closely aligned. As Julieta Chaparro has shown in her powerful critique of reproductive extractivism in Peru, where the toxic outflows from mining have fatally poisoned humans, animals, rivers, and the land, the consequence of corporate negligence is the reproductive death of entire ecosystems. As she writes, quote, "The framework of reproductive extractivism reveals that what is extracted is more than raw materials. It is the strength and vitality of all living communities in territories where extractive industries dominate." The very same indigenous communities who have long celebrated the complexity and interdependence of reproductive infrastructures in ecological, environmental, and existential terms are now not only suffering the fatal penalty of their contamination by multinational mining companies, but witnessing firsthand the direct proof of their much more sophisticated understanding of reproductive cause and effect. But this view of reproductive systems as interconnected and fertility as a collective good, indeed of all interconnected fertility as a shared reproductive commons, is also increasingly to be found at the very epicenter of industrial capitalism here in the global north and indeed here in Cambridge. Like Julieta, I also look at the imagined reproductive interconnections of people, animals, plants, and the land in my chapter in the new book, which explores the campaign to revive old orchards across the UK. These rich mosaic habitats, often abandoned to rot and decay in marginal fields and wastelands, have become unexpected fertility heroes in the age of increasing concern about the high cost of intensive high-yield agriculture. Community organizations like the UK Orchard Network are mobilizing to reclaim old orchards not only as diverse wildlife havens, but sites of what I call, frutility. The conscious melding together of social, ecological, educational, ritual, and horticultural activities with a new environmental bioethics at their core. These new eco-commons are symbols as well as sites not only of a new understanding of reproductive cause and effect, but of cause and effect as a set of relations, a reproductive infrastructure, if you will. And it is on this theme or question of reproduction as an infrastructure and infrastructure as a means of reproduction that I would like to close, because to me, after so many years of working in this field, one of the greatest ironies about studying reproduction is that it is so vital, so ever-present, so embedded, so constant, so everywhere, and so important, and yet still so marginal to so many areas of study, and sometimes even difficult to see or name. The repro lens allows us to consider reproduction as a perspective, as much as an object, a how as well as a what. The injunction from feminist anthropology to drag reproduction to the center of social theory derives from this same hermeneutical political approach to reproduction. The idea of infrastructure as a means of reproduction is a similar way to add relational complexity to what we understand reproduction to be or do, and likewise, a focus on reproduction adds to the idea of infrastructure a particular way of modeling both social and biological process. We take this very seriously in ReproSoc, of course, where the reproductive politics of our own infrastructures have always been a top priority and involved a lot of tea and cake and collective celebration, as well as songs and poems, obviously also sheep and dogs and pandas and lemurs, as well as Bateson, our own raccoon reprobate, mascot, companion, traveler, and ReproSesh and ReproDoc, and ReproWrite and ReproShop and ReproTalk around the clock, and in the great green tea room there were a dozen laptops and banners and a red balloon and cake and a picture of a place called Zoom and a sheep jumping over the moon. So thank you, everyone who's been a part of the ReproSoc journey so far. We've worked really hard and had a lot of fun. And we now have socks in our DNA. Oops, seems not to be there. And so there's no going back. Taking the means of reproduction so seriously could not have been more enjoyable and fun and thrilling, even, without such a passionate commitment to working collectively together. And welcome to everyone who would like to join us in the next phase of ReproSoc as it goes virtual and international. And finally, yes, finally, the final slide. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.